Today, I'm going to be sharing with you guys a pretty classic case, a case that I spent a lot of time digging into over the last few days. Deep in the Knox archives, pulling out rare old documents and materials in my research so that I could learn everything there is to know about space pancakes. All right, so today we're going to talk about the famous Flying Saucer Joe Simonton, and his space pancakes. And I've got a lot of information for you guys, so just bear with me. I probably could have cut it down. You're going to learn more about this case than you ever wanted to possibly know. So this case happened on April 18th in 1961, and it took place in Eagle River, Wisconsin, which is in the northern part of the state there. It's kind of it's in the Land of Lakes region, if you guys are familiar with the butter, Land of Lakes butter and stuff. And it's kind of like a resort town, and his house was kind of across the lake, across from this road, in a kind of a rural area there. And Joe Simonton, he's a 58-year-old plumber. Some people refer to him as a chicken farmer. He was not actually a chicken farmer. He just happened to have chickens at his house. And so he's sitting at his house in his kitchen. He's eating lunch. It's about 11 a.m. in the morning. And his home is 4 miles from Eagle River. And he hears this whining sound that's kind of like a jet. And he's used to jets flying over his house because jets fly over his house before. And he's went and checked on these noises before, and every time it was a jet. So he didn't really think too much of the sound. So he then goes to his kitchen and he deposits his dishes in the kitchen sink there, and you can see his kitchen kind of window behind the guy there. And as he's putting his dishes in the kitchen sink there, he sees something outside of his kitchen window, and now he first kind of thinks it's maybe his roof came off. Right? He thought that his roof maybe blew off, but his roof was green colored, and this thing was kind of like silvery or chrome colored. In fact, he sees this bright chrome color object that's brighter than any chrome that he's actually ever seen before, an object that kind of looks like two soup bowls that have been put together. And that's a pretty great illustration I found of it. And this object here it's 30 feet in diameter, it's 12 feet high, and it's got these exhaust pipes, which he says are 6 to 7 inches in diameter, that kind of run along the periphery region there. And he sees it land nearby in his driveway. And you can see kind of his house, and he has his kitchen window, and out there where those guys were investigating, that's his driveway, and this is where this thing kind of landed there. Now, the idea that this object is a kind of a flying saucer, he says, never crosses his mind, because he's not really into the UFO topic. He says he hasn't really read anything about UFOs. And he says that he's barely familiar with the topic. And so he's unafraid. He goes outside to check out on this object. And as he approached it, a hatch opens in the top half of the disc, and a man appears in the entryway. This illustration is a little inaccurate. It was actually about probably 5 to 6 feet off the ground, and so it was quite a bit higher up. But in this entryway, he sees this 5 foot tall man. He's wearing a black turtleneck pullover with a white band and a belt. And the trousers has a vertical white band along the side as well. He suggests this means he's an officer. He sees 2 other figures that are also visible inside, and these figures don't have the white band. They are described as being Italian looking. He says they're roughly 125 to 130 pounds in weight, and he estimates they are 25 to 30 years old. He says that the complexion of their skin is slightly, I guess, more dark or olive. I guess that's one of the reasons why he thinks they're Italian. And they're also wearing this kind of form-fitting kind of black cap that covers the top of their head. And it either covers most of their facial hair, or they did not seem to have much facial hair. And this man, he's standing in this hatch here, and he's holding up this jug, which appears to be a metallic water jug. And it's got these kind of like 2 handles on each side. And he makes a gesture as if to drink, as if he wants it filled up, and hands the jug to Joe Simonton. Simonton, I'll point out, he never actually says a word. This whole encounter, there's just basically these hand signals or these gestures he makes. There's no actual verbal communication this entire time. And so Simonton then takes this jug and he goes into his house. In his basement, he's got this water pump. And he thinks about what he should do, but ultimately just decides, well, they want some water, so let's fill up this jug and take it back up to them and just kind of see what happens. And so he fills it with water. He returns to the man again. Now, as I said, this object is actually a bit higher up, so he has to tiptoe and grab onto the side of the saucer with his left hand for support while he hands the jug up to this man. While he's in this kind of elevated position, he can see on the inside of the object, and he sees there are 3 men total. And he sees there are some control panels. I believe there are about 3 of them. One of these men is working on the control panels, and he pays Simonton no notice or attention at all. Another one of these men is basically he's cooking what looks to be these kind of little cakes or pancakes or cookies on this flameless grill. Simonton then takes a step back from the craft, and the man takes the jug from him, and then he gives Joe this salute with the back of his hand. It says he puts the tips of his fingers of his right hand up to his forehead and just gives a salute like that. Simonton then decides to give the standard kind of military salute in return. And then he says he doesn't know why he did it, but perhaps it was because he was trying to get them to say something because they hadn't said anything this entire encounter. He makes a motion as if he was eating. And he is intending to actually communicate the question, like, are you guys eating? Because they're cooking the food there. And so he points to the cook, who has ignored him the whole time as well. So the other 2 men never pay any attention to him this entire time. But the officer, he then goes and he picks up 4 of these cakes and he hands them to Joe Simonton. And they're 3 inches in diameter by about 2 inches in diameter. Or 3 by 2 inches, and they're perforated with these little kind of small holes. After the man, this officer hands these pancakes to Joe, the hatch kind of seals up. And when this hatch seals up, there are no visible holes or seams. It looks as if there was never been a hatch in the first place. And he makes gives an example. It's like, you can no more see holes there than you can see a hole through my hand. Now, this object, sounding like a large generator or an electric motor, flies 20 feet off the ground, then tilts upward at about 45-degree angle and abruptly shoots away to the south, vanishing from sight in about 2 to 3 seconds. Now, he describes the way it moves up off the ground identically to how he describes it landing. He says it's smoothly like an elevator. So when it came in, it sounded like knobby tires on wet pavement, he said, but it came down smooth like an elevator. When it left, it made this loud, large generator electric motor sound, rose up smoothly like an elevator at 20 feet, tilted at a 45-degree angle, and then shot off. Now, when it did this, there was this jack pine tree that was kind of behind the object that took the brunt of this blast, which he says it wasn't like an exhaust. There was no fumes, but it was just kind of like this blast of air. And the top 8 to 9 inches of this pine tree kind of snapped back. And then it just snapped right back into place, seemingly unharmed. They found no traces on the ground from any sort of landing. In fact, he decided it must not have actually landed at all. It just kind of hovered there, 5 to 6 feet above the ground. Now, after this thing takes off, he's standing there holding these pancakes. He takes a bite of one of these pancakes, and he says it tastes just like cardboard. And he says he never takes another bite of it again. He says they're not very palatable. However, one person apparently described it as tasting kind of like cornmeal and said it was actually palatable. I do not know actually who that person is. Now, this entire incident, it only lasts no more than 5 minutes, and then it's over. He would go on to tell the story to various people over the next few days, and they would mostly kind of laugh at it or not pay it much attention. There's one note that says he may have told the story to some of his egg cartoners, I guess for his chicken, they bring him egg cartons, who then told the story to the judge, but that actually kind of contradicts the rest of the reporting. What basically happened was that on Friday, this happened on a Tuesday, he went to see the judge at the courthouse and tell a story, but the judge was busy in court and couldn't see him. He ends up calling the judge at 11 p.m. at night. And despite it being late at night, Joe wants to tell him this story. And so he comes over and tells the story to the judge that night. Now, this Judge Frank Wellington Carter, is a local UFO buff, and he actually runs the local UFO club, and he's also a member of the Washington, D.C. group, the National Investigation Committee for Aerial Phenomenon. And so Joe knows this guy's interested in UFOs This guy also was an amateur magician. He was a ventriloquist, an amateur hypnotist, and he did magic and was a member of some brotherhood of magicians and performed at various events. You can actually see him there with his ventriloquist. So anyway, so he meets up with this guy, and Joe knew that he was a UFO guy. Joe allegedly never went to any of the UFO meetings or groups, but he did attend a public forum that this guy gave on the battle for the moon between Russia and the USA, and knew that he was involved in the UFO community. And so he wanted to tell this guy this story. And so he tells him the story. The judge, he gives the judge one of these pancakes, and he immediately passes on a nightcap. Like I said, he meets him at 11 p.m. on April 21st. He mails the letter to Nightcap on April 21st. So he literally wrote this letter and packed off this pancake, shipped it off to Nightcap right after meeting Joe Simonton here and telling him his story. Now, Nightcap, of course, at this point is not really all that interested. They're kind of skittish about occupant reports. They don't want to be seen as being interested in little green men stories. Or contactee stories. In fact, Richard Hall, who is Kehoe, does not respond. Richard Hall, who is Secretary of Nightcap, responds to Judge Carter, and he says, in view of past history of so-called contactee claims and the subsequent exposure of many of them as frauds, we can only adopt a position of extreme skepticism in the present case. If Mr. Simonton is telling the complete truth, it is unfortunate that he will have to suffer from the sins of previous contactee claimants. And he actually gets a bit harsher later in the letter here. He says, you have put us on the spot somewhat by announcing before consulting us that we would analyze the cake and announce the results publicly. In effect, it seems you have expected we would accept Mr. Simonton's story at face value and be willing to link ourselves publicly with it. Again, in the view of the past history of such claims, this would make us appear uncritical indeed. We are engaged in very important liaison work with Congress, which may well lead to hearings on UFOs. And we do not propose to compromise this work for the sake of an unproven and, you must admit, fantastic sounding claim. Accordingly, we do not wish to have any further publicity in connection with this claim unless strong supporting evidence is forthcoming. And they would also, in their Nightcap's newsletter, the UFO Investigator would only kind of publish this short blurb on it about a new contactee claim. The recent spaceman contact claim at Eagle River, Wisconsin, received so much publicity that it unfortunately may lead many to think the UFO mystery a joke. According to Joe Simonton, Eagle River plumber, a flying saucer landed in his yard April 18th, and 3 spacemen gave him some pancakes in exchange for a jug of water. In line with our policy, Nightcap will evaluate this report for any real evidence of a contact. To date, no such claims have been proven. Many are frauds or delusions. This sensational news story probably will be used by the Air Force for added ridicule of serious UFO reports. We urge our members to offset any actions by citing the massive documented evidence of UFO reality and putting unproven contact stories in their proper light. So you can see Nightcap was not all that really interested, but at this point, the Air Force enters the story. And on April 26th, the case would come to the attention of Project Blue Book head Major Robert Friend after hearing of the report from the Air Defense Sector in Duluth, Minnesota. Friend would then speak to Carter over the phone, and Carter, of course, told him that he sent the report to Nightcap. They're going to analyze it. And so Friend, thinking Nightcap would play the story up for all it was worth in the press, apparently not knowing Nightcap had little interest in doing that, decided to send investigators out to get a handle on the case first. Now it's hard to imagine why Friend would think that Nightcap would be interested in taking this bait, since it had already generated quite a bit of ridicule in the press at this point. Further, the Air Force were also no fans of single witness reports. And the reason they really only kind of took this on was because they were hoping to stop Nightcap from making some sort of circus out of this. And so in this regards, he ends up getting a hold of Blue Book's scientific advisor, astronomer J.L.N. Hynek from Northwestern University, who is not that far away in Evanston, Illinois. And they also, some personnel from the 676th Raider Squadron out of Antigua Air Force Station in Wisconsin were also sent to investigate. Hynek would enlist the help of 2 of his graduate students, Walter Weller and John Tumlin. and they would drive that night. So he called them at, I believe it was 10:45 a.m. and they left at 3:45 that afternoon, and they were in Eagle River by 5:45. So they drove from Evanston to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where they rented a single engine plane, I believe a Bonanza, to fly to Eagle River. When they arrived, they get in touch with Bob Sautran. He's a reporter at the local Vilas County newspaper. And they try and ring up Simonton, but have no luck getting in touch. So they decide to just head out to his property. But Simonton isn't home when he gets there. They eventually track him down at his in the neighborhood at one of the neighbors' houses. When they get there, so they track him down to the neighborhood. They take him back to the house. And when they get there, they go around the farm, taking a bunch of pictures of the area, and they examine the pine tree that was hit with the blast of the air. Now, Hynek then invites Simonton to dinner, where they would continue this conversation. At dinner, Hynek would note that the local townspeople all seemed to respect Simonton. He would excuse himself then later to go talk to people at the bar to kind of get an idea of what other people were saying in the town. And he said most of them believed his story. There were some that were loud skeptics. Like I said, he was a well-respected member of the community. I guess he played Santa Claus every year for the local Chamber of Commerce, and people considered him a reliable guy who didn't drink. He may not have been the most educated, but they thought he was a fairly reliable guy. Now, when Hynek was over talking to these other guys, his graduate student, Walter Weller, took the opportunity to talk to Judge Carter, but would have very little success in getting the judge to open up. Apparently, because the judge, was a big flying saucer buff, he thought they were from the Air Force, and in a way they were, but they weren't Air Force employees. And the Air Force was considered persona non grata, his own words, amongst the local UFO enthusiasts. Now, Hynek wound up getting Carter to actually open up a bit, and he would actually win Simonton's confidence as well. And Simonton would end up letting him read many of the letters that he had received since the incident. The general tone of these letters was that he should be very careful of trusting the Air Force with any information, and he certainly should be careful of giving them any physical material samples, as he would likely never see them again. And the entire thing would just be hushed up. So Simonton would ask Hynek some kind of questions to kind of gauge where he was with things about his opinion of NICAP and Kehoe. And he must have been satisfied with his answers, because he ended up giving Jalen Hynek one of these samples for Project Blue Book. And that's a picture of the sample there in a display case at Wright-Patterson. Another sample would be given to a different Air Force investigator from the 676th, and a third piece he ends up keeping for himself. Now, apparently, there was some other people. There's a guy in Los Angeles that's blacked out that I have no idea who got that sample, and have not had any luck tracking it down. Apparently, later on, he would also give a piece to a reporter at KTSP named Bud Meyer. Now, the cake that was given to Hynek would be sent to the Aeronautical Systems Division of the Air Force Systems Command, which was actually a fairly new division. I believe it's just kind of officially started a couple months earlier, but it was a continuation of prior divisions, just kind of a new name, to analyze the sample, right? And in a Blue Book document, they would indicate that the cake was prepared from a low protein flour with small quantities of sugar and salt and cooked in hydrogenated oil. Another piece of the sample would be given to the Food and Drug Administration of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or that's what it was back in 1961 anyways. And they performed a more complex and thorough analysis, but found mostly the same results, that the food was made of terrestrial but tasteless ingredients, including hydrogenated oil and buckwheat flour. In fact, microscopic analysis of the pancakes not only showed like the buckwheat, but the hulls from the buckwheat and various other things indicating terrestrial ingredients. So like I said, it's just normal oil, essentially the same results that was reported by the Aeronautical Systems Laboratory. The sample that NICAP got was first sent to Professor Charles Manny, who was going to have a colleague analyze it, but he was sick, and the guy ultimately ended up passing away. So the sample ended up going to Lex Mebane, who was with the Civilian Saucer Intelligence Group of New York. He received the sample from NICAP, and while his tests were preliminary, he also found similar results. There's a lot of controversy about the sample and it not being tested in time, and the judge wanting it back, and that's kind of all long and drawn out. And how NICAP basically did a preliminary sample, but they didn't want to spend a few hundred more dollars, and this is 1961 dollars, to have further tests done, considering it was just going to be a same results as everyone else. They did actually finish testing it, I believe, eventually. And so, again, he found basically the same thing: normal, earthly, hydrogenated cooking oils. As did Bud Meyer, the guy, the reporter, who was also given a sample, who had an opportunity to taste it. He said it wasn't very palatable. He took his sample to be analyzed at the University of Minnesota, and they came up with the exact same results. So, what did the Air Force have to say about this case? Now, the Air Force basically, they conclude the case with an explanation from an anonymous psychologist, also from the Aeronautical Systems Division, who kind of gave an off-the-cuff response, just kind of theorizing. He never talked to Joe, or, he was never actually, analyzed or interviewed by a psychologist. And his suggestion was that, in his opinion, the witness suffered a hallucination and subsequent delusion concerning his experience. These hallucinations may be a one-time experience brought on by circumstances which may never again be present to the individual. They believe that while Simonton was an honest man, he has mistakenly conflated the reality of his breakfast with a waking dream, and he essentially kind of inserted that dream experience into the continuum of his waking memories. So what are we to think about this case? As we pointed out, Simonton was well known and liked in his community. People that knew him well thought him incapable of a deliberate hoax, nor did they think that he was mentally unsound. Unfortunately, that's what people always say. Oh, I don't think I can commit a hoax. I'm not saying that he committed a hoax. But what did Hynek have to say about this? Well, again, Hynek would say he answered questions directly. He did not contradict himself. He insisted the facts would be repeated exactly as he stated them, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. And this is actually kind of a very interesting part of this, interesting aspect of the story, is that he actually was very, very specific with repeating his story the same way every time. In fact, when the few kind of copies of him telling his story we have, like in audio or video, he says the exact same sentences in the exact same way. He does not alter or deviate at all with the way he tells his story, which is kind of interesting. So then Hynek would also recall later on, this is a bit further on in 1975, that he was not at all impressed with him personally or his surroundings. He lived in this sort of shack on the outskirts of town. The man could have been a wino. The yard was sort of unkept, bottles and so forth, but they weren't wine bottles, just untidy. My interpretation at the time was that he had been having pancakes himself for breakfast, suddenly had a waking dream or an isolation delusion. As his views on the UFO phenomenon generally moved in a more positive direction in the years to come, Hynek would consider more seriously the possibility that Simonton had experienced a real encounter. He also told his story to other members of the community, not just the judge. He told it to the local deputy attorney, Clive Burton. He told it to the local sheriff, Joe Schroeder. And Joe, the sheriff would report, Joe really believes everything he says, and he isn't a drinking man. He talks sensibly. The district attorney would say that Simonton sounded sincere, added that he had a good reputation in the community, and told a straightforward story. Simonton told the district attorney he was reluctant to talk about the incident earlier because people might think it was preposterous. Bob Sautran, the editor of the Vilas County Review, remarked, if you took a vote around here, most people would say Simonton's story is authentic. On the other hand, a number of people who had telephoned to ridicule the story. So there's always a little kind of bit of dissenting view kind of going on. One potential answer for this story might have came from a guy named Harry Pride, a local real estate broker from Eagle River. He would claim that he concocted the story as a yarn with some friends as a publicity stunt to drive up tourism for Eagle River, which was, a resort town after all. He claims they got Joe drunk and then they hypnotized him. While under hypnosis, they made him repeat the story 20 times. I also read 29 times in there, but to make sure he got the details right and repeated the story the same every single time, which he, in fact, actually did. Pride would then kind of later change the story a bit and say that the original hallucination actually happened. They only actually hypnotized him so that he would be able to repeat the story the same way every time. And while this is potentially plausible, there's no evidence that was ever provided, prove this claim. And not only that, there's at least some anecdotal evidence that it was false and it was a joke, because the judge actually knew Harry Pride. And he spoke to Harry Pride and told him that this lady, Cynthia Hess from APRO and Nightcap, was telling the story that he had hypnotized people. And Harry Pride told the judge that it was preposterous, that it was a lie, that it didn't happen. And now the judge did think that Harry Pride might have been pulling a prank on this lady, this Hess lady, and did actually tell her that, but that the story is false. They didn't hypnotize anyone. In fact, he says the Harry Pride doesn't know how to hypnotize anyone, and he doesn't know anyone that could hypnotize someone, except perhaps the judge, because he was a hypnotist. Anyway, so we can probably dismiss kind of that case there as the explanation. He probably wasn't hypnotized. In fact, there is some potential corroboration that comes in from an insurance agent and a scoutmaster named Savino Borgo, who at roughly the same time as Simonton claimed he saw a saucer while driving on Highway 70, roughly a mile from Simonton's home. Borgo said the object rose diagonally and then flew west parallel to the highway. Unfortunately, this case did not seem to be investigated, and it was only briefly mentioned. In fact, I'm not even sure where it was reported to, because I could not find it in any newspaper articles. It was kind of just mentioned by APRO, so perhaps it was mentioned to APRO. So what's the aftermath out of this? What did did Simonton really have anything to gain about it? Because people said, he had nothing to gain. There was no benefit for him doing this. And in fact, he would tell people that he actually suffered from this. He said he was unable to go to work for 3 weeks, and he's going to have to start making money somehow. That all the people basically calling all the time, and this got major coverage. Newsweek called people, people from around the country called, and this was a big major story. And so I can imagine a lot of people coming by might have interrupted with his ability to do his plumbing work. It was also kind of published that these chickens of his died, 20-something chickens died after the encounter. But ultimately, it was kind of determined that they were malnourished, and there were there were some indications that they were kind of actually already dead, or some of them were already dead, and that he had failed to bury them, and they had just been laying and left out in the yard. So I'm not sure we can tie those chickens directly to this kind of encounter. But he would say that if he had another UFO sighting, he would keep it to himself. He would then go on, though, to publish this little pamphlet of his, The Story of the Flying Saucer. It was essentially like a 1-page, 3-part pamphlet that he sold for $1. There's some evidence that perhaps later sold them for $3. And in fact, I found one event that he was speaking at where he sold 29 of these in one evening at this dinner. The local Chamber of Commerce would also go on to name him Man of the Year. He would travel around to tell his story on the lecture circuit for a bit. He was the main speaker at an annual space age convention in Mountain View, Missouri. That, I believe, that may be the Buck Nelson convention that he went to in June 1963. In April 1962, Simonton would be the guest of honor with Aunt Jemima at a big Pancake Day event staged by the Rhinelander Lions Club. Rhinelander is basically the nearest kind of larger town to Eagle River. Now, who cares what we think, right? Like, what does Simonton have to think about this case? Now, he kind of became disgusted. He said, again, if it happened again, he didn't think he would tell anyone about it. But, you know, he would actually see something again. And a ufologist named Lee Alexander from a Detroit UFO group in 1970 claimed that he visited Simon, who told him that he had a few more alien visits, but chose to keep them quiet. And but however, he was in the news again. Now, I couldn't find the actual news article. I just found a later news article that referenced it. Because in August that year, August 1961, he supposedly saw 2 UFOs for about an hour, for about half an hour with a neighbor of his named Mike Fredrickson. So he did have another sighting later that year. And in fact, in addition to that sighting that that Borgo guy had at roughly the same time, there was some people that said they saw a UFO in the area a few days later. And then there was another sighting that was a bit more well-known of some boys and a family on the 27th that also saw a UFO in the area. So there was some other UFO sightings contemporarily at the time. So what did Simonton kind of, you know, think about the case himself? What did he think the things actually were? So he believed that these men were from outer space. And this is his kind of fairly interesting logic and reason he gave for this. The men in the saucer resembled us here on Earth, but there was something a little different about their dress and their expression, and above all, their food. If they ate the pancakes like they gave me, their taste sure was different from mine. To me, these pancakes tasted like cardboard. If you don't know what cardboard tastes like, just take a bite out of it and see for yourself. All countries here on Earth have rations to carry and with them for food, and when they go in the field and are on long trips. They don't cook the food as they go. I think that is enough reason to think they're from outer space. So according to Joe, their food tastes bad, and there's no reason they would have been cooking food. They must be from space. And who are we to disagree with Flying Saucer Joe? Because as Joe would say himself, I don't care what anyone says, but I know what I saw. And this is a very interesting case. It's one of these cases that it's hard to know what to do with it, right? Like, it's, on one hand, are we to believe extraterrestrials came down here to eat very terrestrial, boring buckwheat pancakes? So given that, it's very hard to not call it a hoax. To me, the psychological explanation, while plausible, isn't entirely satisfactory either. It's just one of those kind of strange, weird, fun anomalies that you have in the UFO community, in the UFO literature. That's an interesting story. And, you know, it's really kind of just up to you on what you want to believe. Now, I'm going to try and bring up a quick video here. Let's see if this works real quick here. It's 3 minutes long, and it's just Joe telling a story real quick. You can hear it in his own words, and you kind of decide for yourself what you want to believe.
Flying saucer, this UFO landed right here about where I'm standing. And it was a big, huge thing, and I wondered what the heck it was. I was in my kitchen having a bite of lunch, and I turned around, put the dishes in the sink, and I looked out the window. And that's when I first saw this thing coming straight down, just like an elevator. And first I thought the roof went off of my house. And I thought, no, the roof is green and this is bright. What the heck is it? So I rushed out to see what it was. And by that time, there was a hatchway opening up in the top of it, just like the trunk of your car. And in there stood a little man. I say a little man, about 5 foot tall, holding up a jug or a container. And he motioned, he wanted to drink. He motioned for water. So I walked up to him to get this jug, and I looked at his eyes, and they were so penetrating that I had to look away. So I went to the basement to get this water, and I thought, well, they want water, so I'll take it up to them and see what happens. And with that, I brought the water up, and he was looking at me when I first came out of the basement. But I didn't look at his face until I got right up to him. Then I looked up, and I handed the jug up with both hands, and I had that same look in his eyes, a sort of a penetrating look. And when he took the water, I balanced myself with this hand against the machine, and I stepped back a few steps. And then with that, he set the jug down, and he gave me a salute with the back of his hand, a gesture of thanks, I presume. And then, well, I gave him my salute. What am I going to do? So I noticed this little man, same size of a man, right to the right side of the hatchway, cooking these pancakes, which I have one here yet. He was frying these pancakes, and I pointed to him and made a gesture like eating. I thought maybe I'd get a conversation out of him. Nobody was saying anything. But he didn't say a word. He just reached over and he got a handful of them, 4 of them, and he handed them down to me. And they were hot and greasy. And this man cooking these pancakes, it was on a square grill-like concern. I couldn't see any flame, but it seemed to be very hot. There was smoke coming from it. And if that was their food, God help them, because I took a bite of one of them, and it tasted like a piece of cardboard. And if that's what they lived on, no wonder they're small. And with that, he reached up and he closed this hatch with a heavy thud click like when it latched. And you couldn't a bit more see where that hatch was than you could see a hole in my hand. And with that, the thing started to raise just like it came down. Everything was timed perfect. It went up about 20 feet. It tilted at 45 degrees straight south and shot off. And within 2 or 3 seconds, it was out of sight. Well, there I stood in the driveway with a handful of greasy pancakes and my mouth open, wondering what the heck I saw, what had happened.
It is outside the realm of the Air Force to pass judgment on Mr. Simonton's case. However, the pancakes that he turned over to the Air Force were turned over to the Food and Drug people, and they were analyzed as pure buckwheat pancakes.
Joe Simonton of...
So that's Simonton in his own words. There, you can find a video if you check my thread on Twitter or Facebook, where there's another copy of him telling his story later on, and it's pretty much identical. As far as whether or not he had any buckwheat around, there's no evidence, figuratively or literally, that he cooked up this story. So no, there's no evidence he had buckwheat around that I'm aware of. There's some of the people suggested the pancakes might have actually been cooked with beaver grease, because one of his neighbors, I guess, was a famous trapper, and that's why they were kind of. So these pancakes were also kind of very rubbery and hard. And the judge actually said it kind of smelled and tasted like goose grease that his mother used to put on when he was sick. So, yeah, I don't know that there was any evidence that he had any buckwheat. I don't think so. They said there was no evidence he cooked them up himself. So, if you're curious where the pancakes are to this date, there is still the nightcap sample is now in the hands of the National Ufo Historical Record Center with David Marler. He still has a tiny little kind of piece of it. And then the piece that Blue Book has is in that kind of display case, which apparently you can still visit at Wright-Patterson to see. I'm tracking down supposedly another copy of a piece somewhere, but I haven't heard back from that yet. So all I know is that if I had the piece of pancake, I would eat it and report back to you guys to let you know, because how can you not eat a space pancake? Anyways, back to you, Rachel.